politics, economy, and sorry, I'm just going to, yeah, the meeting is being recorded. Okay. A series on politics, economy, and public policy. As you all know, this session is scheduled for the first Monday of every month for 1 hour from 5:45 p.m. till 6:45 p.m. Nepal time, which is also from 7 till 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time or 12 noon UK time. This past November also marked the completion of 1 year of this webinar. As you are all aware, Professor Avidit Acharya was the organizer, and for this year we have formed a committee to take on the mantle of continuing with this wonderful webinar. There are 3 of us in the committee. I'm Praveen Khadka, Assistant Professor at the University of Essex in the UK. We also have PhD candidate Sudhyamna Dahal from the Australian National University and Benisha Nepal from IIDS. The speaker for today is Dr. Ambika Adhikary, Principal Planner, City of Tempe, Arizona. Dr. Adhikary's background is in architecture and urban planning, and he holds a PhD from Harvard University in urban planning and design. Dr. Adhikary will be presenting his paper titled Towards Smart and Sustainable Cities in Nepal. Dr. Adhikary's work includes advancing long-range planning efforts for the Community Development Department of City of Tempe, Arizona, to promote the goals and policies laid out in the Tempe General Plan and other planning priorities and policies of the city. His major areas of work include promoting sustainable planning and design, walkable streets, stable neighborhoods, vibrant downtown, enjoyable open spaces, and preservation of neighborhoods, everything that we Nepalese dream about for our cities. Dr. Adhikary also has a long and rich teaching history at the Arizona State University, where he has taught graduate and undergraduate courses in international development and planning, environmental planning, and administration and community development. Our moderator today is Dr. Pratistha Joshi Rajkarnikar, Associate Director, Economics in Context Initiative, Boston University. Dr. Pratistha holds a PhD in economics from University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's also a lecturer at the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies. She also teaches economics in visiting position in the Sustainable International Development Master's Program at Brandeis University. Dr. Pratistha's teaching and research interests broadly focus on economic development and macroeconomic theory and policy. Her recent research examines the consequences of male labor migration from Nepal on women's empowerment. Finally, polite reminder of some of our ground rules. Please keep your mics muted unless you are invited to speak. Dr. Adhikary will speak for about 30 minutes, which will be followed by a few minutes of commentary from Dr. Pratistha. We will then open up for our Q&A session. Please send your questions using the chat forum or raise your hand using your Zoom feature. Dr. Adhikary, over to you. Thank you. Dr. Adhikary, you are muted.
Thank you so much, Professor Khadka. It's a pleasure to be in the midst of such a distinguished group of people, and Dr. Rajkarnikar and everyone. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak a little bit. The way that you introduced me, I'm really grateful. That's very generous of you. As you can see, I'm more of a practitioner, although I have a little bit of a academic tilt and interest, but I'm in the actual field of planning. Let me share the screen. Okay, so the topic today that I am dealing with is with the Towards Smart and Sustainable Cities in Nepal. It's a very broad and generic topic, so it's not like the typical very narrow level research presentation that we often hear in IIDS. It's a kind of 35,000 kind of overview that I wanted to start with. These topics are very important and interesting for Nepal also. There's a lot of talk going on about sustainable studies, sustainable planning, smart cities. Sometimes they become cliche. We don't actually sometimes know what they mean and what they don't mean. So let me try to make some sense out of going through a very global perspective and then come to some of the overall overview of what can be done in Nepal and what are some of the issues in the best practices. What I would try to cover today is I will talk briefly about the global urbanization, kind of a review. And then the urban development in Nepal, some concepts I'll throw around about sustainable urban development. I'll also talk about some smart city concept that's been going on. That's kind of, pretty a matter of interest even here in the US. And then we will speak about some smart and sustainable cities elements that could be utilized in Nepal. And then we'll go with some policy recommendation type of issues. So let's go through a urbanization global perspective. A lot of you guys are here very well versed in the world development and also the data set about the global urbanization pattern. So let me throw a few numbers. As we know, in 2021, the estimated population is almost close to 8 billion people, which is a very large number. I still remember people talking about we reached 7 billion. I think that was in 2011. That was a milestone. Now, approximately our growth rate globally is slightly more than 1. I think that's pretty much the way that it in Nepal also. So when you look at the annual growth rate, that comes to about 82 million. And when you visualize it, it's a pretty astounding number. That's the size of the population of Germany. That's a big number. If you make it into a daily population growth, so every time, if we meet this in 24 hours tomorrow, there will be 225,000 more people in the world. And why I'm saying this, because 95% of all this growth happens in developing countries and the least developed countries. And the planners and the policymakers have to deal with that, think about infrastructure, think about housing, think about water supply and all that services that we need to provide, the municipal services we need to provide to that group of people. Obviously, this is spread around across the world and it's mostly in some of the large countries, but still when you visualize on the global scale, it's an astounding number that the planners have to deal with. That's why the sustainability, the smart city concept, anything to do with infrastructure and development become very, very important. Now the cities, as I was saying, the majority of the growth happens in the developing world. Now here's a UN data from 2018 projected to 2020. And if you pick up the top 14 or 15 countries, the brown color is the cities in the countries which are in the developed world, Tokyo, Osaka, New York. Otherwise, all those large, out of the top 14, 15 countries, the large agglomeration of the metropolises are in the developing countries. In other words, the infrastructure is poor, the services are poor, the management is poor, the capacity is poor. Sometimes not all that poor, but oftentimes it's limited. That's how it all needs to be dealt with by the planners and the policymakers. You'll see a lot of pictures in this slide. Vast majority of the pictures these are from my own phone, but here's a picture from the UN. It's a pretty dramatic picture. On the top is Caracas, Venezuela. The right side is the formal economy. The left side is the informal economy and the settlement. And when we talk about planning, we're dealing with a lot of that informality type of situation that the planners need to provide, the urban leaders need to provide for. The picture down at the bottom is also from Brazil, Sao Paulo. On the right side, as you see, with the swimming pool on the balconies and all those tennis courses are more of the formal economy, the rich people who own the land, who've got all the documents. On the left side, you see the informal economy where people are just coming from the villages and trying to make a life in the cities. And they don't own the land. They basically build houses and try to make a living. The important element when you look at all this urbanization and the urban system is the density. Obviously, in a fine-grained densities, it's a person per hectare, a person number of people per acre. But for the overview and for 35,000 view, you can think in terms of the number of people per square miles. So you will see that in some of the bigger cities, especially in the US, Canada, and Australia, the population density is extremely low. Initially, that was thought that it's a rich people's privilege, but as we find out, the less dense areas are less sustainable, less smart. You can see Atlanta has only 1,500 people in average per square mile, whereas Mumbai has 73,000, Manila has almost 150,000. And Kathmandu is also very dense. This is only for the Kathmandu city, not for the whole metro. It's about 55,000 people per square mile. The city that I live, city of Tempe, is about 5,000 people per square mile. It gives you a sense of the higher densities. There is a challenge to provide infrastructure. There is a challenge to provide transportation. There's a challenge to provide services. But if you can manage those things, that's a more sustainable approach, because per capita length of infrastructure, per capita services of road, anything that you provide is low. Your footprint is low, carbon footprint is way low, and the densities are in favor of the city. Here is a comparative chart by Alain Berthaud. He used to be the chief planner in the World Bank. I kind of used to know him a little bit, very well known in our community. He's now a little older. He teaches at New York University. He does an amazing amount of work at the intersection of the economics and urban planning. Actually, he's written a new book, which is on the intersection of planning and economics. Here we go all the way from Atlanta, all the way down to places like Mumbai. Those are the graphs of the people, number of people per hectare. That gives you a sense. There is another image from the UN. On the left side, it is in the same scale. You see Atlanta with 2.5 million people. Look at that physical size and the spread. And you see Barcelona, which is also a rich place. And 2.8 million people on the same scale. You can see the geographical footprint of the city in the map. So it gives you some dramatic differences on the density. On the right side is also a picture from the UN, a more recent picture from Mumbai. You can see the dividing line. On the upper side is the formal settlement, where people own the land, they buy the apartment, they own the land, and they are now economically better off. On the bottom side of the picture is again the informal settlement, just the way that we saw in Caracas, Venezuela, and Sao Paulo, Brazil. This is something that all of you know very well. This is by K. Rateworth, the Donor of Economics, in one UK economist. I'm putting this slide just to show that sustainability concept, there's a ceiling of the environment where the cities or any other kind of growth can happen. That upper ceiling is limited. Beyond that, things do not become sustainable. And there's also a lower kind of the inner circle where the basic demands and the basic environmental services and the urban services are also not met. That green area is somewhere we want to aspire for as urban planners. We do not want to go above the ceiling where we rupture the climate change and all the other issues, but we also want to provide for the basic necessities of everyone. Now let's take a quick look on the urban development in Nepal. Let's look at some example. Again, it's a big topic, so I'm going in a very overview type of fashion. The urban growth in Nepal now is pretty rapid, as all of we know. Obviously, it depends on whom you ask. What is the percentage of urban population in Nepal? The government probably will say almost 40%. The World Bank will say no, probably just about 20%, because the way that we define urban agglomeration in Nepal is kind of pretty loose. Anything more than 5,000 people, even if there's no urban infrastructure, are oftentimes taken as an urban population, but the international norms are, doesn't really matter in population, but is it like, is there sufficient density, is there services, is there like urban accessibility? Those are the kind of things that are measured. This gives you a graph, nevertheless, from Statistician in 2021, the urban population in Nepal is hitting about 7 million out of 30 million people. Now, let's take example of the Kathmandu Valley and look at the growth, density, and infrastructure. We've had all that big overview that we just took a look. Now, it's hard to find the actual census data in the valley. The one that's available is from 2021, which we know is very dated, because the growth in Kathmandu is very, very rapid. Actually, in the urban sense, it's one of the rapidest, fastest growing areas in the world. 4% growth rate. As you saw, the annual population growth rate in the overall population is just about 1%. We're talking about 4% growth rate. My estimate from many different sources, and later on in discussion, someone can probably have a better data and you can correct me. I think we're reaching in the valley, if we take the entire valley, between 3.5 to 4 million people in 2021. Again, if we go back to the initial back of the envelope calculation that I was showing, if you take a quicker look at the annual growth rate in the valley, that comes to about 150,000 people. Again, think of that. That's now real for us. That's not abstract. 150,000 people is bigger than New Bhaktapur. It's almost the size of the Biratnagar a few years ago. We have to provide housing. We have to provide services. We have to provide for the facilities for all of those people every year. That's where the burden for the government, the planners, the architects, private sector, and everything lies down. But we do have some benefits. We are still the initial culture is the compactness. We do used to arrest the sprawl, which is not the case anymore in many of the Nepalese cities. But by and large, the system, as I was talking about, the more dense system are more sustainable. Especially the cities in Kathmandu were pretty dense. We know the infrastructure is still inadequate. There's a lot of work that is being done, and also the pollution is high. I will just take two examples here. The congestion and the pollution are two of the really good proxies of how the urban system is working. We all know Kathmandu is one of the worst polluted cities in the world. Sometimes it's even ranked #1, but it's always on the top 10. And the pollution level is way higher than what the WHO guidelines show, or even the Nepal government's guidelines show. As you can see at the bottom, there are times when the pollution level is very high. So those are some really good indicators why sustainability and smartness are very important. Of course, there's a water supply, there's like a sewerage, there's other forms of transportation, there's greenery, there are open spaces. There are n number of things that the urban services are needed, but very visible are initially the two: the urban congestion, the way that you're stuck in the traffic, and then the pollution level that you bear every day, and then also your health is badly impacted. Those things are very well defined. Now, here's a visual growth that is from the World Bank and JICA and other sources from 1967 onwards to 2011. The red color is the footprint of the urbanization. The green, of course, is the greenery, and the yellow is more like semi-agricultural land and rural settlements. And it's very dramatic to see that within 50 years, the growth rate and the expansion and the sprawl rate has been extremely dramatic in Kathmandu. Actually, if you look at the city that I live in, Phoenix, the charts are very much similar, except that there's much better planning that the American system usually does, because it's also very unsustainable here, a lot of sprawl. Now, let's dive into a few areas about sustainability, livability, and quality of life. That is one of the elements that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. All of this leads to how we can become more sustainable and more smart. Now, what makes the city livable and sustainable? We all know it from our own experience. We want clean air, we want clean water, like Dr. Khadka was saying, everything that we want. And we want open spaces, we want adequate infrastructure, and most importantly, housing. I know we read a lot of stories about Nepal. Sometimes we don't think that's a planning issue. People don't get a place to live. They can't rent, they cannot buy, nobody can afford. Those things have become very important, even in places like US and everywhere. We will not talk much about that, but those are very important on making a city livable and sustainable. And then obviously there is the pedestrian friendliness is extremely important, both for smartness, the passive side of the smartness, and also for the sustainability. We want cities to be transit oriented. We want the transportation choice. There's a big buzzword in the planning arena in the last 5-7 years. They call it a 15-minute city. Actually, it arose from Paris, and then later on in Melbourne, and right now in Tempe, Arizona, and many places. What that means is wherever you live, anything that you need on a daily basis, all the amenities, the open spaces, the shopping, the gym, the school, everything except the place of your work has to be available to you within 15 minutes of walking, bike ride, or transit, not car. So two exceptions: no car, and no, not the job, because for job, you want people might have to drive. They want the best of the jobs. So does the So do the employer. They want to have the best of the employees. But if you can really provide the amenities within 15 minutes of where people live from their door, within the 15 minutes of walking, bicycle, and transit, your city becomes much more sustainable and much more smart. And Melbourne, they claim, is pretty close to a 20-minute city, 15-minute city. And then Paris, I believe, is pretty much a 15-minute city. So that's one of the things. As you see, jobs are hard. Even in Kathmandu, people have to drive. But if you can meet the major amenities, the shopping, the schools for your kids, and everything within 15 minutes, probably in Nepal's case, we want to probably even reduce them down to 10 minutes because we are more compact and our streets are narrower. So how bad is a car? Obviously, the car was a big liberator, but more and more in planning, car is the antithesis of sustainability and smartness. And here is one diagram, that two-bedroom apartment of about 700 square feet on the left side, which is average house size in Nepal. And then also the two-part garage on the right side. If you look at the driving aisle and the side on the parking to open the door, our typical car parking space is 9 feet by 20 feet. If you look at all of that, the size for the two car and the size for the family of three, you need to provide the same amount of space. That is horrendous. That is sad. So that doesn't make anything sustainable. So that do not help us. Now, I will also relate it to the Sustainable Development Goal 11, which says that's the UN SDG. The goal number 11 is the title is Make Cities Inclusive, Safe, Resilient, and Sustainable. All of that basically encompasses services, energy, housing, transportation, and green public spaces while reducing the resource use and environmental impact. That is what makes a place sustainable and smart. Now let's take a quick look on some of the planning approaches towards the sustainability. Now, both for sustainability and smart cities, one important element is what kind of utilities and infrastructure services is what you're providing for. I would divide those utilities and infrastructure on two arenas. One is passive, the other one is active. Passive is something that you don't really have to service every day. Once you provide it, it doesn't take extra energy, it doesn't take extra input. It's like a wall, or it's like a walkway, or it's like a park. It's pretty passive. Once you do that, some of the elements that really helps you towards your sustainability and also your smartness. So we're looking for passive water and for landscape. And if there's time, I'll talk a little more about what that means. Let me give you a quick example. So one of the passive water supply element is on-site water harvesting, which we do a lot here. I live in a desert. The rainfall here, the annual rainfall in Phoenix area is 8.5 inches. In Kathmandu, it's about 55 inches. In Pokhara, I think it's even more, sometimes 16 inches. And even here, we actually, in some cities, it is required that half of your landscaping and irrigating water is from water harvesting, which is kind of, the rain falls on your roof or in your ground, you basically capture that and you reutilize that. And then similarly, there's a drainage system also. A lot of it can be low impact drainage. We know that in Kathmandu and many Nepalese cities, when it rains, the roads and everything is flooded. Those are not accepted in every circumstances in places like US and other developed world. There has to be some way to retain that water. There are retention well, there's a detention well, and there's also a system to take them through a pipe. But there's a low impact drainage system that if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about later on, that you can do through natural system and also what is called a rain garden. Basically, any landscaping that you do is from rain. In places like Nepal, there's so much rain and the land is so fertile. Very often that concept of rain garden is very easy. We don't have to work very hard. But the place that I live is desert, so those things are very important. That amount of water that you really want to capture and fully utilize. Similarly, the passive solar installation is very important. I think Nepal is doing extremely well in that regard. India is one of the pioneers. Obviously, about 40% of the total solar installation is in China in the whole world. And then to make it sustainable and to make it smart, the broadband is also important, which I think Nepal is doing reasonably well. Now, transportation and connectivity is another very important element towards sustainability and smartness. Use of single occupancy vehicle is the worst enemy of the planners. Like they say, the Google is the worst enemy of the doctors. And the public transit is important. We are reasonable in Nepal. A lot of work needs to be done on that one, but that's not too bad. The example on top, on the right side, is the rapid bus transit in Ahmedabad. That's a long time ago. I studied in Gujarat, so I know that area a little bit. I visit there once in a while. I'm a big fan of the rapid bus transit. Even in Nepal, I think it could be done. And the one at the bottom, obviously, is in Nepal, we have very limited road width. And sometimes, that's one of the constraints on rapid bus transit, but I've got some ideas on how that can still work. Now, the hybrid remote working, the way that it's happening right now, just the way that we're talking from 4 different continents, like Dr. Kharka was saying, this has become feasible. And even in developing countries like Nepal, some type of work, teaching, and so on, can be hybrid. That helps. Now that 15-20 minutes city in Nepal, I would like to reduce that to 10 or 12 minutes, something that we can work for. And then with that hybrid system, there's a whole new system of parking and all that transition that we need to think about. Here's one graphic that I just put because it's a slide presentation. It's from the EU study. It's a pretty astounding study. Look at that droplet of the gasoline in the middle. Look at that top thing, about 5% of the whole thing, the red one. That is the amount, that's the percentage of the total gasoline, petrol, or the oil that is used, that is actually utilized to transport a person from point A to point B. Rest of the energy that we use in a car, if you use a car, rest of the energy is going to fight the friction, the aerodynamics, moving half a ton of the vehicle that is not really needed, and a number of things. And of course, there are fatalities, there are accidents, and so on. So it's extremely inefficient form of transportation when everything was abundant, when we thought it was a means of freedom. Car was a big liberator, but more and more people are finding out. And in urban planning, that's something that we like to minimize, the use of car. Now, open space provision is something that everyone living in Nepal knows how bad it is, how bad the situation is in Nepal for that one. Well-distributed open spaces are very important element of sustainability and also the smart cities. There are standards and there are measures, and especially in our places where there's like a disaster like earthquakes and other issues, people need to go meet in some place, and even on a daily basis, open spaces are extremely important. They are Frederick Law Olmsted, the father of the landscape architecture, as they say in America, used to say the parks are the lungs of the city. They help the city breathe fresh air. The standards in the US are very high. They use 300 to 500 square feet per person. The total in Nepal generally is 50 to 60 if you look at what happens in India, Bangladesh, and so on. But if we increase it to like 100 square feet per person, that would be a wonderful indicator, and it has to be well distributed. And smart cities oftentimes have indicators to indicate people which park they can go to, which are the kind of more therapeutical garden. We are all stressed out in the urban area. So sustainability and smartness is also about our psychology. The picture down below that you see is from Honolulu, Hawaii. And if you go to places like that, then obviously you are more relaxed, you can de-stress. And Singapore is a pioneer in what is called the therapeutic garden or the healing garden. We are far away from that in Nepal, but there's a lot of effort in Nepal also. I see some good gardens and places outside, especially in places like Pokhara and other places. So those are very important. Sometimes we forget smartness is only the cars and roads and buildings, but your psychology and everything is also part of smartness. Here is some more pictures. The one on top is from Phoenix. The one below is from Honolulu, Hawaii. That concept of edible landscape is also very prevalent these days in the planning arena. Whatever we plant, if it is accessible, if it is also edible, if it is an agricultural thing, you can do fruits, you can do cauliflower, in university gardens out here, there's a lot of fruits and vegetables that they grow. It looks really beautiful. You can also eat it. So there's a student housing and all of that. And I remember I taught at Pulchok in Institute of Engineering in Nepal, which has quite a bit nice campus and open spaces and so on. Kirtipur is another really good example. A wonderful edible garden and the community gardens can be done there. I know Nepal is sort of a pioneer on rooftop food production and also balcony food production. Actually, the UN Habitat has produced a booklet, gives Kashmir is one of the good examples on how people grow vegetables and everything on top. And I know the vice chancellor, the current vice chancellor of NAST is also pretty big into the green food city. So those are important for sustainability and so on. Now, some of the smart city element, I'm also looking at time. Someone can give me a cue, but I think I've got another 7-10 minutes remaining. The smart city elements they use the real time and digital data, oftentimes through the Internet of Things. So that is the basic idea behind this smart city. The Internet of Things is connecting the physical elements of a city, like the building, garage, the cooking, the streets, and everything, into the system of the internet and connect it through the computing so that real-time information could be gathered, monitored by the city leaders, and then the distribution of resources, whether it's energy or water supply or drainage or parking or open spaces used, can be shown by digitally. Very often here we can see if the parking lots are full. And when you go to the airport or some places, there's a sign outside. That's a very basic element of smartness. At least you know you don't want to go to that floor, you want to go to another floor. That's already that you don't waste your energy and you don't drive around and create pollution because you know that you go to fifth level, there are openings. Those are some of the really basic elements of smartness. Those are more active elements, and these passive elements I talked about, the solar energy and gardens and rooftop gardens and other areas. Now, the smart cities are also user-friendly and they have a higher quality of life and they look for sustainability. That is the whole goal. So there's a big intersection between smartness and sustainability, but sustainability is a larger goal. Smartness is one of the means to achieve it. Now, how does a smart city work? The Internet of Things is the main thing, real-time data. There are lots of cameras, sensors, and mobile phones. There's a continuous feedback and there's a management, and the passive and the active elements both work together. The picture on top is a place that I work near city of Tempe on how public art and open spaces and everything are combined. The one below is also a picture that I took close to the World Bank in Washington, D.C., that now because of COVID, there are hand washing stations. There is like a disinfectant in the parks, they put it. So, you know, they think of these smart issues and smart interventions right away. Now, the smart infrastructure, again, the picture on top is in Poland, hand washing station. The picture at the bottom is the Gandhinagar that senses air pollution and provides the warning on what is going on a day-to-day basis. I know we do that these days in Nepal also. There's a forecasting of pollution level so that people know it's not a good day to drive. So that real-time element, connecting what actually goes on, connecting it to the internet, and then also finding out how you intervene and how you make a difference and how you communicate. Those are the basic elements of the smart city elements. But I also have to talk about the critique and the criticism about smart city. Smart city is an evolving concept. The picture on top is Toronto, Canada. Now, there was a smart city concept that was in implementation by Google company, a very large company with a deep pocket. Now, within 2 or 3 years in 2020, they actually had to pull the plug off. What happened was all that sensors and cameras, there were systems of automatic snow melting, that things will automatically heat up and melt. All of that thing that had begun on the lake side, that's the Lake Erie, on the sidewalk. People didn't like it because it's an intrusion to privacy. And people in developed countries are very much sensitive towards the privacy and any intrusion there. So the company had to pull up the plug. The one below, again, I used to frequently go there in Abu Dhabi, the Masdar Institute, a place where the money is not an object, right? They wanted to create a sustainable and smart city in Masdar city. That also is a kind of failure. Even now, people have to actually drive. There are no good walkways. Obviously, being a rich place, when you go outside, the internal vehicles are all Lexus. They try to do some good architecture with passive elements of cooling, but on the whole, that system also was not very well thought out. It didn't work very well. So there are many places where the smart city concept hasn't worked. In place, city in Mexico, the planners wanted to create a smart city, but that was such a traditional city. The local people said, no, we don't want any smartness. We don't want cars. We don't want really big wide roads. We don't want any of the digital things out here. This traditional urbanization out here is fantastic. So, smart cities, not for everyone. And there are criticisms to that. But in our kind of situation, in Nepal's kind of situation, some of the smart elements, I think, are extremely important to make the city more efficient, more sustainable, and more livable. And we can be selective in terms of digitization. I do not know how true this is. I read in a New Business Age magazine in Nepal, the smartphone penetration is 136%. Obviously, they count all the SIM cards and all the different elements that a person has. Very often people have 2, 3, 4. And so when you count all of that, the smartphone is penetrated very well. This is a very important infrastructure for smart cities, so that can help. Now, internet and computing is also not too bad in Nepal. That can also help. And the traffic management, parking, and the utility provision is somewhere I think we can begin to selectively look at some of the active smart element, the passive smart element that I just talked about, the solar energy, the sidewalks, the walkability, all of that, I think we can do very well. Because the tradition in Nepalese cities, especially in the Kathmandu Valley, walkability and compactness, we accept. We can teach the world a thing or two on that perspective. We are totally walkable place. We can bike and walk. But the 15, 20-minute city probably was 7-minute city for us long time ago. But with the modern city system, we've lost all of that. And that's where we need to kind of go back and pick up some of the good elements that we had in the tradition, and also pick up some new things that we have seen in the smart city. So the prognosis for Nepal is not too bad. We are newly urbanizing, so there's a lot of things that we can learn from other people's mistakes, like don't do what the Americans or the Canadians did in the urban sprawl. That's a no-no. And obviously, also being a mostly hilly country, a lot of drainage and all that is very easy compared to when you come from India to Nepal. You can see suddenly some cleanliness, and the water ponding is less in Nepal because, except for the plain area, in most places there's a natural drainage system that we can exploit. Then there's a rich history of good traditional planning and design that I just talked about. Things are not too bad. We can emulate some of the traditional vocabulary and the planning approaches. We had a lot of open plazas and cultural resources that people used to get together. The open spaces are also pretty well defined. We can go back to some of those historic resources. Now, some quick recommendations. Obviously, you start with smart element. The picture you see on top is the rain garden at Arizona State University. It doesn't rain here a lot, 8.5 inches in the whole year, but when it rains, you want to capture it and then redirect it to the area where you want to plant things. Actually, a lot of the plants out there are also edible. And we talk a lot about urban forestry, gives you a shade, gives you lungs to breathe. We know the benefit of all the trees. Nepal was actually, when I first came to Kathmandu, it was a paradise. It was like, the trees were like a garden. We've lost a lot of that. It can be reforested. Permeable paving is another good thing. The urban areas flood because many of the pavements are not permeable. But if you have a permeable paving, a lot of water will just percolate, and then it will also recharge the groundwater. That's another big thing that's happening in the smart city and sustainable cities arena. It's often called the low impact development, LID, that you provide permeable paving. You have the solar photovoltaic system, you have rainwater harvesting, rain gardens, and use as much possible daylight, and then the ventilation and solar control. Those things are very low-hanging fruits sort of situation that we can use in Nepal. The smart technology, when people have phone, when you have a transit system that is connected with the apps, that can also be very helpful. And those elements, I think, can really help us. So in summary, the global urbanization is important in human history. As you know, there's an annual growth size of Germany, 95% of it happening in the developing country. Even in Kathmandu Valley, there's a new Bhaktapur every year that is being added, for which you have to provide housing and all these systems. And smart and sustainable city elements are very important to kind of counter some of that. And some of those elements that I just talked about are very viable in Nepal. We can help improve the function and quality of life by adopting some of the passive and active elements. And as a newly urbanizing country, we're in a really good situation to learn from what other people have done and create a compelling future. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciated it. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Adhikary. Dr. Pratistha, if you could take another few minutes to comment on Dr. Adhikary's work, and then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Dr. Adhikary, thank you so much for that excellent presentation and for your research on this very important subject. I like how your paper provides a very hopeful and optimistic outlook on possible approaches for building a more sustainable city through a selective and incremental process, where we're thinking about smaller changes that are possible in order to achieve more sustainable development in the longer term. Given that ecological crisis is one of the major challenges we face today, and also that the burden of environmental costs fall disproportionately on poorer countries, the need to integrate issues of social and environmental sustainability into development policy making is more important than ever. And I think your research makes valuable contribution on this front. I also think it helps really to think about the way forward for developing countries like Nepal, where rapid urbanization and population growth could, on the one hand, contribute to economic growth, but also add to environmental costs and challenges. And I kind of in this context, I had three broad questions that I wanted to start with, and then we can probably move on to the questions on the chat box. First, I think you've made some excellent suggestions on development of infrastructure projects and technological changes, such as using smart technology for parking and traffic control for building smart cities. And I'm wondering, what are some of the complementary changes in terms of development of human capital or building institutional capacity that are needed in order to support this kind of development? Second, you've presented some examples of failures of smart cities and mentioned that the outcomes have been somewhat mixed. And I'm wondering, in the context of Nepal, do you see any concerns or potential risks with implementing some of the suggestions that you've made? So for example, how successful do you think the rapid bus transit system would be in encouraging the switch from private transportation to public transportation, and whether we need additional incentives in order to motivate this change? And then finally, from a policymaking and implementation perspective, how feasible do you think these solutions are in the context of Nepal, and in terms of like thinking about how far away we are from actually achieving these changes? What do you think the prospects for the changes are? Would be great if you could shed some light on these questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rajkarnikar. That's those three questions are very important. Thank you also for your good words about the presentation. I appreciate that. Now, on the first one, on the human capital, the smart city or sustainable city is not only the physical element. You are absolutely true. The human dimensions, the human capital, how people feel, how inclusive the society is, how just the society in the city is, and how well governed everyone feels, how democratic it is, are extremely important. Those are part of smartness. Those are part of sustainability. Obviously, that's one of those three pillars of sustainability that we talk about. And in smartness, it actually starts a lot with the municipal governance and also the nonprofits and many others, the organizations that the residents do. One is obviously with the e-governance, things become a little more democratized. The access becomes very easy. I know Nepal is also doing very well on that regard. As you see some of the smart cities here in the West, there's a lot of e-governance. So people from all kinds of capacities can work. And then there are trainings, human capital building. There's also that inclusiveness. We didn't have, I only talked about very high level things on how people with physical disabilities can access the services in the city and can really go in from one point A to point B through sidewalks. There are lots of standards and norms. How universal design into housing, people can really go with a wheelchair, all those things are very important. So the human capital, not only in terms of the population and the residents and the citizen, but also in terms of the people who actually implement, plan, and organize and lead those elements are very important. And the training of the municipal engineers, the teachers, the people who actually work in the ward on the decentralization level becomes very important in sustainability. I know Nepal has done very well in many arenas like community forestry and especially rural development. Some of those examples of the good practices, the best practices, I think can be brought forward to urban planning also. Question number two, the failure of the smart cities are pretty visible. So smart city is not like a silver bullet. It doesn't really help in every field. Not everyone buys into it very easily just because the privacy concerns as we become richer, even Nepal, the big cities in Nepal are pretty much middle class these days. People are concerned about their privacy. People are concerned about their access. People are concerned about many things, the tradition, culture, history. Oftentimes the smart city may not do it very well. So you got to redesign the smartness in such a way that it caters to a lot of public demand. I'm a planner, so in planning, public consultation, the trade-off and the public input is the most important thing that really defines the profession. So that's one way to really, anything that we want to implement, like you say, incrementally in bite-sized pieces, is something that we can organize. One of the positive things, once again, in Nepal is the nonprofit organizations. They meet with local people. They have excelled at. These are some of the best practices. Example of the pictures that you see in the World Bank, ADB, and UN publications are from Nepal, partly because so much good public input is happening in villages and rural areas. Again, in the urban areas, sometimes people are in a rush, so that public participation would be very important. Now, right now, it's a hybrid mix. We do have public bus systems in Nepal. We also have private, and the most important problem right now is the private single occupancy vehicles. Used to be bikeable, used to be walkable, but those things are kind of fading fast in Nepal. So can we implement BRT? Obviously, we can implement BRT. If Ahmedabad can do it, Kathmandu can do it. Ahmedabad is about 7 million people. If you go downtown Ahmedabad, cows are still grazing and people are still outside, and it is the same as you go to Watutol in Kathmandu. And the Modi's government, I think, had the political will to do it, can be done in Nepal. And it will always remain a hybrid system. All the public system, the entire public system in transportation is not feasible. It has to be public and private. There could be private minibuses, just the way that we have, except that they are more smart. They don't have to idle. They can go in a fuller speed. We have dedicated lanes. Those are the important elements, in my opinion, on that one, from my experience here. Now, on third one, the policy making, the feasibility of solution and prospects is something that I touched upon a little bit. I do believe the incrementalism, actually, we have a theory in urban planning. It's called the science of muddling through. In other words, it's a science, but it's not right. It's a wicked problem. It's not, the answers are not given to you like in physics or in chemistry. You learn it by doing, you do a part, you consult with people, there's political actors, and then you muddle through it, and finally you figure out a way through incremental mechanism. I think we can identify some really good elements of sustainability and transportation. I've spoken with some of the planners in Pokhara and Viratnagar, Adhikary, in Kathmandu, people who work in the municipal level. I work in the municipal government. Things actually happen in the local government. As a matter of fact, a long time ago, LaGuardia, who stood for the presidency of the USA, who wanted to, people wanted him to stand for the president. He said, he was a mayor of LaGuardia, New York. He says, who wants to become a president if he can become a mayor of the city? So the things actually happen in the city, and the municipal leadership can be trained and documents could be prepared. We are not too bad on that either. A lot of things are happening. I do think it's feasible. Dealing with the actual infrastructure in the beginning is a Herculean task, but that's something that is not unknown to many of us. Thank you so much, Dr. Rajkarnikar.
Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts on that. I see two questions on the chat box. The first one is on the data. So this is from Samir Casey, who says that the Labor Force Survey 2019 reports that 2 out of 3 people live in urban areas, and the Census 2011 reports it to be about 18%. So he's curious about how the statist calculated the data and what the source of the estimated population is in the valley.
So I touched upon that a little bit. Excellent question. Thank you so much, Samirji, for that one. Basically, the authentic data on how much total urbanization in Nepal can be disputed. The data, like I said, are kind of different. If you look at the World Bank data, I think they say more than 20%, 20 to 24% in 2019 of Nepal was urbanized. The government data shows many, many different numbers, like in the question itself, 2 out of 3 is 67%. The Nepal government's, I think, urbanization metrics is somewhat a little generous. It might have been done for the benefit of funding and budgeting purposes. I think smaller agglomeration of people, even if they don't have really good urbanized infrastructure and urban culture, are still defined as urbanized. My own guess, although I haven't been back to Nepal for a couple of years, I would think, looking at all the data, it is safe to say that maybe almost a quarter of our population is urbanized by any internationally accepted definition of infrastructure and so on. What was the second part of that question, Dr. Rajkarnikar?
What is the source of estimated population in the valley?
The source of estimated in population in the valley, I don't have the specific source. The 2011 census numbers are very low. I think Kathmandu city itself, the Kathmandu part is shown less than 1 million. Bhaktapur and there's a lot of new cities that spring up like Timi and Kirtipur and so on. If you add all of them right now, with some estimation of 2019-20 data, it comes to about 2.5–3 million people. But there's a lot of floating population. And then if you look at, there are some papers that people have done, the Nepali planners have done and presented. There was one that was presented in the East-West Center in Hawaii. So when I look at many, many different sources, so that's what I qualified right in the beginning. That's my estimate, between 3.5 to 4 million people. If someone has a better number, I would really like to learn a little bit about that. After the 2020 census, I think we'll have a better handle on exactly how the population is doing.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Mr. Ram Acharya, who says, city size is an equilibrium brought about by the accumulative actions of individuals and firms incentivized by policy decisions. Take Kathmandu, it would be impossible to even maintain the density, let alone reduce it, given the present policy trend in Nepal. It seems like in major cities in Nepal, it is not only passive and active parts that will bring the cities in sustainability. Where should Nepal start in addressing these issues? Any thoughts?
Wow, I mean, I wish I could really answer that question very well. That's a great question. I can answer a few, I can attempt from some perspective. Of course, when I was a student, we used to study about the optimum city size. There are many different theories on what is the optimum city size. Because too large a city can be difficult to maintain, it becomes anonymous, it's really hard to reach, and too small the city doesn't have the economy of scale and it doesn't have good enough jobs and choices. So all of that, I think, used to be academically important in 70s, 80s, and 90s. in planning arena, those questions have somehow faded away because those things have become somewhat irrelevant these days because, the chart that I was showing earlier, the Tokyo, Yokohama, I think that's 37 million, one agglomeration of the urbanization. Same thing, the Northeast corridor, all the way from Boston to Washington, D.C. is one kind of single megalopolis in America. And there are city-states which are like 4.5, 5 million people like Singapore, or 9 million people, or 8 million people like in Hong Kong, which is basically one city. And there are places like in Mexico City. Once I lived in Canada, worked for a consulting company and used to fly to Mexico City, sometimes come back the next day. And I used to say that, oh my gosh, Mexico City is 75% of Canada's population. Canada is the second largest country in the world by geographical arena. And, Mexico is 7,300 feet high in a valley. And even then, I think it had 23 million people. So the size somewhat is irrelevant in the sense that, Singapore is one of the best examples any which way you look at in urban planning. We take examples from them. So that equilibrium somewhat may not be all that important. What is important is that 15-minute city concept or 10-minute city concept. Where you live, what kind of services you can really muster within 10, 15 minutes of walk and bicycling and public transit is probably the most important. And then in that question also, there was a very interesting indication about if there's any equilibrium on the size and urbanization. Now, one of the benefits of the big cities or any city or urban areas is the employer can find the best employee, and the employees can find the best and highest paying employment. Now, the Alain Berthaud in his research basically finds, even Jeffrey West from the Santa Fe Institute basically finds that every time you double the size of the city, there's a 15% gain on the salaries of the people and the amount of innovation. So when you increase the size of the city, they actually compare it to the metabolism of the living organism. There is an efficiency to be made. So I would not get stuck too much on the city side, but really appreciate that question and being able to share my thoughts on that.
Sure, great, thank you. I see Dr. Praveen Khadka has raised his hand. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, very quickly. Dr. Saab, thank you so much. My question is more related to your experience and your background rather than the presentation today. Because I was wondering, if any government agency were to hire someone like you, it would be thousands of dollars, right? For example, currently where the World Bank is helping the Nepal government with the New JIP, Nepal Urban Infrastructure and Development Project, which is $450 million. But let's say if the government of Nepal were to use someone like you, probably you'd do it for, free for, as a public good. So I was wondering, has the Nepal government directly approached you formally to help with this smart city concept? Because, this is an important question, right? We have someone like you, with such tremendous expertise and background. So this is a private question, but, it's an extremely important one also. Thank you, Dr. Saab.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khadka. Thank you so much. You might be overestimating my qualifications. I'm pretty simple, normal person, but I did teach at the University Institute of Engineering for about 12 years, and I was heading the IUCN, International Union of Conservation of Nature in Nepal for 3 years. So I also led one Canadian International Development Agency's project on the solid waste management in Nepal a long time ago. As I grew older and kids were growing up, I decided to move and settle in America. So I'm old, so I had all that luxury on that year. And I have worked with the government as a partnership. I kind of, was somehow employed by a public sector. In Nepal, the university was owned by the government. No, there are many, many people like me. Actually, the younger people are way smarter than I am because, we come from the age when we used to root the Nepal is a landlocked country. That was my English lesson. That's all I knew. And cow is 4-footed animal. So, people have come a long way. People are very smart in computing, all that smartness that I talked about. Haven't been approached, but I'm close to retirement in a couple of years. And if my health permits, more than happy, and I'm financially stable now, so more than happy to provide any pro bono service with Dr. Swarnim Wagle We had some discussion on that, on interest of people like myself and many people who are in the retirement age who might have something to give. It's not easy. Many people have, people in the World Bank, ADB, UN, and the Nepali government system are not unsmart. They're very smart. People try to do things in all these developing countries. Those systems and those challenges are not that easily solved. Those are wicked problems, like we say in planning. They are not tame problems like in science. But we can always pitch in a drop. We can always give our 2 cents. And in a few years, if my health permits, more than happy to provide my 2 cents on when it is feasible. Dr. Kharka, thank you so much. It's not personal. I appreciate that question.
Maybe one last question, Dr. Pratistha. I can see one last question in the chat box.
Yeah, sure. So this is from Mr. Krishna Gewali. He says he joined late and could only listen to the last segment of the presentation. And a question that always keeps haunting my mind is whether we can redefine in Nepal's geospatial and cultural context the very concept of cities and villages, to use the conventional terms, and explore and establish commonalities between them so that the rural-urban migration can be managed and counterbalanced in favor of both. To put it plainly, can cities be like villages with rural character of heritage conservation, use of conventional wisdom and technology, clean air, fresh and organic food, and cohesiveness in living, etc.? And also, can villages be like cities, embracing connectivity of infrastructure and accessibility to services, jobs, and markets? Can we avoid a trade-off between cities and villages?
Oh my God, that is so poetic. That is so amazing. So that's music to my ear. That's wonderful. I mean, all those thoughts are extremely important, and we could redefine, and we need to kind of walk a fine line between pragmatism and all that good things that we want to do. We definitely want to maintain our heritage and culture. That's one of the rich things that Nepal can offer to the rest of the world, and how well the cities were and how well organized many of our traditional system. As poor as we were materially, spiritually, I think there was a lot of richness to be shared. So I fully appreciate that spirit of that question. On the pragmatism side, people want to have income. In today's today's system, people don't want to completely live on agriculture. That's why people migrate from rural to urban area. That's how I estimate all the cities, all these slum pictures that I showed you. People are better off even in those slums compared to where they are in the villages. Actually, Doug Webster, one of the really experts, professor of ASU, and also he was in the World Bank. He's a planner, Canadian guy. He used to say that in China, he's an expert on Chinese urbanization. He used to say in China, the disparity of income on how much wage you can earn in a rural area versus in the urban area, maybe anywhere between 8 to 20 times per day. So people can make up to 20 times more money per day when they move to a city compared to where they are in the rural areas. First of all, there's no employment. The only employment is in the agriculture. The productivity is low. There's no financial transaction happening. So people will continue to move in cities. Cities are the future of the world. So, people want to, the incomes are, the job opportunities are very high. So we all go to big cities. I'm not against cities. Cities are good, but the good linkages that you talked about is extremely important. I also believe in another thing. For any country to really spark and jumpstart the economy, there have to be more than one primate city, which is in the case in Nepal. Practically, the valley is one city. Apart from that, we had nothing else happening. I'm so glad that Pokhara and few other places are now doing well. Unless there are like 3 or 4 different really good agglomeration like in India, things do not get sparked, and that connectivity and alignment doesn't happen. But I appreciate that we need to maintain our heritage. We need to maintain the balance between what we do and also how the rural areas become the important areas to support the cities. I think those are all very important. Thanks so much for that.
I see Dr. Swarnim Wagle has raised his hand. And I know there are a few other questions, but we're out of time, so.
Are we out of time, or I think we usually go up till 8:15.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure.
I think, yeah, sorry. Can I had a query, Dr. Ambika Adhikary, on this ZIFS law. I recently did a graph, actually just yesterday, and posted on Twitter. I put this on the chat box as well. I don't know if people can open it. what is interesting, and this is starkly evident in the case of the US, the most populous city here is New York City, right? About 8 million people. The next largest city is LA, which is 4 million people.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then you have Houston and Chicago, 2 million people. And then, so, it's a big urban mystery, I guess. And I was trying to plot something similar for Nepal. And it's, of course, there are caveats. Kathmandu is composed of many municipalities. But if you take Kathmandu Mahanagarpalika, it's about 1 million people from the last census. Then you have Pokhara, which is exactly half that size. Then you have all the remaining Mahanagarpalikas, 4 of them. Bharatpur, Birganj, Biratnagar, which is about 2.5 lakhs. And then you have the Upa Mahanagarpalikas, which are roughly half that, right? So, it's a very interesting, and if you do this plot, on the y-axis with the log of population and log of rank on the x-axis, you get a straight line, right? I mean, there's, nobody planned it that way. God did not plan it that way. Man or woman did not plan it that way. It so happens a lot of these urban shapes, probably because of agglomeration, appear that way. So what is, I know Ade Glazer has a theory, his simple theory is that, people like to be closer to other people. And so, there are limitations imposed by boundaries, etc. But do we have any thoughts on this?
Wow, excellent, Dr. Wagle. I mean, that's used to be, once again, I go back to my student days, there used to be theories of the city sizes. And like you said, the second largest city oftentimes will be half the largest city in the country, and there will be some sort of distribution pattern in the developed world. But even then, on the developing countries, those things actually didn't work, because all the big cities, like in Thailand, there was only one primate city, Bangkok, and in Philippines, there was one primate city, Manila, and even in Nepal, like I talked about, we had one primate city. So the second cities were way, way less than the half the population of the big cities even then. But that's a very important analysis that you've done. The response to that, in my opinion, is again, the previous cities were kind of detached from one to another because of the transportation. We didn't have freeways. There was a railway link, and even the flight patterns were only for the rich people. So things happened in a region. There was a need for the city, and that city had a hinterland, and the whole region was dependent on the city. The city was dependent on the hinterland for food and so on. So there was some kind of organization of the different geographical spatial pattern in the city. That actually has been, technology has kind of defeated that geography. What has happened is there is agglomeration. So we are talking about New York. When you talk about New York, Newark, and all that area, that's a much bigger area. But actually, LA, the Los Angeles area, is bigger than that. LA is 16 million people in the metro, okay, in one county. So sometimes when the city population, we take just the municipal administrative population. That was the 4 million population that we talked. Similarly, when you talk about Houston, that was like the city of Houston. Like city of Phoenix is 1.7 million people, but the Phoenix metro, and you were here, is 5 million people. Effectively, for everything in terms of jobs and services and infrastructure and transportation and pollution, that 5 million is what actually counts as the urban agglomeration. So the distribution in Nepal still will pertain to some old ideas, because we are not very well connected as a country. Our roads are still kind of, better than before, but less. And then flights are also not for everyone. And the region needs a city to have medicine, to have school and university. So I think we have a point to that effect. I was also noting how Pokhara kind of begin to overtake Biratnagar and other places. So I think some good, interesting research, I think, would be a good question on that perspective. But more and more, even in places like India, because of the connectivity, even the place that I live, Baroda used to be a different city than Ahmedabad. Now it's connected by a freeway. Only takes like 1 hour, 100 miles per hour. So things are beginning to change, but I think for someone to do urban research in Nepal, that city, the spatial distribution and population sizes, and the impact on the economy and all that would be very important. Thank you so much for that question.
Should I go on? 2 more questions? I'm not sure.
Yes, please. There's one question, so probably we can take that before we close it.
Okay, so I'll just read them together. There's one from Srijana Koirala who says, given the power of local development plan to local government as exclusive rights, local government and elected bodies have approach of development, roads and buildings as a sign of progress. And even though planners try to introduce smart and sustainable elements, they end up not being implemented. Given such scenario, what are your suggestions to urban planners working in Nepal? And the second question is from Mr. Sanjeev Adhikary, who says, from Kakrapita to Mahendranagar, it is going to be the longest city in the world. How can the government tackle the rapid urbanization in the Tarai region, the food land of Nepal?
Wow. On the first question, the decentralization could be extremely good. One of the things that I really count as the positive elements in US and Canada, and I'm sure it's the same thing in Australia and other places, is how much decentralized these countries are. And that's how, even when there are really bad central politics and really bad international situation, the shocks are absorbed because they are distributed very well. And the municipalities have level of autonomy that I really admire here in America and Canada. The mayor of a country, the mayor of the city can do almost whatever is feasible on that city within the power. So I think the decentralization in Nepal is very important. But that the first comment that Dr. Pratistha you had made about the human capacity, that becomes very important, because planning, again, as much as we want to maintain the heritage and all the good things that we have in tradition, there has to be municipal planning 101 that everybody has to know. How the water flows, how the drainage works, how the transportation will work, where the housing will work, what is zoning, what are open spaces, what are the standards. These things are extremely important. And this is something that we haven't done very well in Nepal. In where the British colonies, in the countries where some other countries had colonized, at least those elements were prevalent. So when I studied in India, I used to say, oh my God, some of the things are planned. They're like roadside drainage systems, and there are, some other urban planning systems that are in place in Baroda and Ahmedabad. Even then, just because that European knew that part very well. And we had our traditional system that may not fully work in really highly modernized work, but that capacity building would be one of the things, training and having some kind of basic standards, having some zoning books and planning books and master planning would be important. That would be my response to question number one to Srijana Koiralaji. I know she's an architect and planner. On the second one, the longest city in the world from Kakarvita to all the way to West Nepal, Nepalganj. Along the freeways, along the highway in Nepal, I know there will be settlements. It is increasingly so when you see it there. It's kind of, thin, but it's not total like an independent urbanization. Urbanization is by and large a good thing in my perspective. There are some places which are like 90% urbanized, maybe even 100% urbanized, like Hong Kong, one of the richest countries, one of the richest places in the world. I actually read that Hong Kong now beats even Okinawa, Japan in the longevity of people. I think the life expectancy there right now is more than 84 years old. So urbanization, if you manage well, can be done very well. Hong Kong, as scary as it sounds to some people, because they're like micro apartments, they call it caves, but it's such a beautiful place. They have maintained all the open spaces. They have really nice parks. Their public transportation system is really nice. They don't allow people to build on the hills and mountains. You can go do your thing. So in Nepal, the highway-induced phenomena of the settlement is the induced demand, which needs to happen. That's not the true urbanization in the regional sense, but that's something that I haven't looked at. I think we can study that a little further. Thank you for that question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saab. So finally, on behalf of the organizing committee and the IIDS, Dr. Adhikary and Dr. Rajkarnikar, thank you so much for your time today. We are extremely grateful. To our participants, thank you for your time today. Thank you for joining us. Next month, we are meeting on January 10th and not January 3rd because of the holiday season. So to everyone, Happy New Year, and please stay safe. Thank you for your time today. Bye-bye. Unless there
Bye,
are
everyone.
any questions, would like to say bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you and namaskar. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Good night, sir.